So a starting point, I would say for everyone, is the diaphragm. So is your diaphragm in the position that it's supposed to be? Is it stacked over top of the pelvis so that you have an orientation of respiratory diaphragm over pelvic diaphragm?
Hello everyone, welcome to the Movement and Performance Podcast, where it is my goal to guide individuals in taking an informed approach to fitness. Today I have with me Arianne Missimer. She's a doctor of physical therapy, functional medicine practitioner, registered dietitian, mindfulness instructor, and the owner of the Movement Paradigm Movement and Health Center. Today we'll be talking all about the deep core. Without further ado, let's get right into it. The deep core. I think when people hear the word the deep core, they might get slightly confused, thinking what's the difference between the core and the deep core? So can you give maybe what are the differences between the two?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about core training in general. And specifically when we're talking about deep core versus, we can put it simply as outer core. Right. The deep core are going to be the muscles that are closer to the joints. That's a good way to think of it. So closer to the spine, closer to the hip. They're going to influence how we're able to stabilize more than create movement. And I think that's the best differentiating factor at the most basic level, is we're thinking stability, motor control, which would be sequencing, timing, and coordination, versus trying to actually generate force.
So would the outer core be more for generating force?
Yes,
right.
And creating eccentric strength.
Right.
So if we're kind of thinking of doing, let's say, a back bend,
right.
Our check mark is going to be that rectus abdominis, right? Okay. To create that eccentric control to prevent us from bending back too far, being able to create tension and ultimately control in the spine. Where the deep core is going to allow us to stabilize, create increased proprioceptive input. It's going to create more of an isometric contraction, so it's creating more tension. Versus an actual movement of eccentric or concentric strength.
So what would you say are some of the big players in the deep core, whether it's any of the anatomy, body parts or muscles, or we don't have to go over maybe every single one, but whatever you think, what are some of those big players that we're talking about?
Yeah, so I think generally speaking, I like to think of the core as all of this, because we are actually thinking about the base of our core being the pelvic floor, and it goes all the way up to even our neck and tongue when we start to get into more of the fascial lines, and especially the deep front fascial line. So if we get more specific into the intrinsic stabilizing system, then that's going to be the diaphragm, which is going to be the cornerstone of everything. Yep. Then we have the pelvic floor, so we have respiratory diaphragm, pelvic diaphragm. We have the transverse abdominis, so our natural weight belt. We have the multifidus, that's helping with rotation, anti-rotation on the spine. And then we also have the deep 5 stabilizers in our hip, and we have the posterior fascicles of the psoas. So a really dynamic cylinder of how we can create stability and how all of those muscles need to work together in an integrated unit. And if one is not working the right way, then it's going to affect the whole system.
So when you say stability, can people think about that in the realm of maybe posture, or like holding a posture, whereas you're not necessarily overcoming or generating a force, you're maybe holding yourself in a position, or how would you,
Yeah, so if we think of, we'll kind of take an example of, let's say, a plank, right? Most common core exercise. So if you're holding a plank and you're holding it for, let's say, 2 minutes, most likely, especially if you're not breathing in that, you're just powering through with isometric strength in all of your other global muscles. So you can bypass, to some extent, stability, and you could cheat the system by using those global muscles and not actually stabilizing. But when we think about our day-to-day life, you have to, in order for you to be able to sit, in order for you to be able to walk, you have to be stabilizing to do all of those things. And the key factor, I think, that's so important is stabilization has to come first. So in order for me to move my arm overhead, my multifidus is going to fire before I even do that. So it has to be anticipatory, not reactive. As soon as we get into that reactive of like, oh yeah, I forgot to breathe, now I'm going to breathe, then we are not stabilizing well. So that means everything is delayed. It's a more reactive pattern, which is what leads to injury and decreased performance.
Yeah, it almost makes me think a little bit like a catapult or something. You know, you have to have that strong base of support that is stabilizing before this, you know, you think like the limbs are kind of like, you know, flinging or more power generating.
Correct. Yeah. So it has to be the foundation, right, of our house, essentially. And if we think just at the most basic level, stability, then strength, then power and endurance and speed and agility, right? So we have to have stability first. And when we do that and we train that way, it's not that one is more important than the other. It's just that it's always an afterthought in most training and rehabilitation programs.
Right, yeah. You know, a lot of times people see the weight on the bar, they just want more.
Right.
More. Quality is, not saying it's gone fully out the window, but it's less of a consideration.
Correct.
And I see that a lot working with, you know, whether it's high school teams or adults. I work with adults in fitness programs as well. But, you know, I usually make the analogy of something like a kickboxing class because I do the martial arts. It's like people want to come in and they love, you know, hitting the bag and going. Right. You still have to learn the technique.
Yes.
You know, you can't just wail away without ever learning how to punch. And it's just that point of quality matters. And that kind of makes me think of quality, you know, teaching technique.
Yes. And in order, it is quality because it's a slower tempo. It's ultimately starting with potentially lower repetition, but then really working towards endurance with it. Because to your point, our postural muscles, which diaphragm being one of the biggest ones, we have to be able to stabilize for long periods of time. So we ultimately have to train it that way.
Then I wanted to jump into a conversation about like developmental stages. I remember seeing in your PowerPoint something with like, you know, a picture of a baby. Are there certain almost like developmental stages or a proper progression that this should kind of go through?
Yeah, so if you kind of think of as babies, we were all born with tons of mobility, right? You could kind of curl a baby up into a ball and they're putting their feet in their mouth and they could pretty much do anything.
Right.
And then they are developing stability through proprioceptive feedback, through the ground, through the wall, through being able to push up on chairs. So they start to develop that stability into first rolling patterns, and then they are able to come up into quadruped, and then they're crawling, and they're sitting, and then ultimately standing on one leg, deadlifting, deep squatting. So when we think about adults, we ideally should have never lost those patterns. We should have those, and we did have those, assuming normal development.
Right.
And what's happened though is because of, we could say probably a million reasons, from what we eat to the lack of movement, sedentary lifestyles, to overtraining, to maybe not balancing out our training, sitting all day at work, all of the things can attribute to our poor quality movement as adults, and then we've lost these patterns. And so what often happens is you might feel like you're stiff. My hamstrings are tight, my shoulders are tight, oh, my upper back is tight. But really your body has figured out a way to create stability because it doesn't have it. It's not challenged the way that it was as a baby. It doesn't have the feedback they did. So now you're tight, but is that tightness actually a mobility issue, or is it just your body trying to figure out how to stabilize and create stiffness to do so?
Right. Yeah, I've learned that when your body's always going to figure out a way to do something, and it might not always be the most efficient way.
It's going to be the most efficient path for you at that time, right?
Right, exactly.
Not necessarily the best one, though.
Right, exactly. But yeah, so walk me through, if you saw that someone didn't have that, or you wanted to kind of start them from the beginning, would you have them incorporate rolls and quadruped movements, or what would you...
Possibly. So I would say the first step would be to identify as objectively as possible what's happening in their movement patterns. So are their movement patterns functional, dysfunctional? Are they painful or not painful? And within that, and that could be anything like FMS or SFMA, depending medical professional, fitness professional, etc. And more than that too, right? It could be definitely, there's a lot of other movement patterns to assess. And to be able to identify, is this a mobility issue or is this a stability issue? Right. So for example, if someone has, let's say thoracic rotation limitation. So I turn to my right, stiff. Okay, I turn to my left, not too bad, but better than my right. But then let's just say a minute later, we retest it again or change my position. And now I can go way farther on the right and hardly at all on my left. So now we already know that that's a stability pattern, not a mobility pattern. And it needs to be trained as such. So that means you would need to teach me how to stabilize in that new pattern, how to be able to build that neuromuscular control, how to be able to breathe in those positions versus just a ton of stretching to get me into that new position.
Right.
And that's where, as professionals, we have the opportunity to really be highly specific about what we're doing and why we're doing it to be able to make change. And so that would, to answer your question about rolling, let's say, is for me with that stability issue, yes, that would be appropriate. But let's say for you with a mobility issue, I would need to address that mobility issue first.
Right.
So we would be working on mobility exercises to be able to give you that access so that then you could stabilize more efficiently.
Right. Yeah. So what may be, there's a couple thoughts that I have there. Yeah. I'll go with the first one. It immediately made me think, and I know a little bit about PRI, but the AIC, am I saying it right? AIC?
Yep, anterior.
And I myself, I can feel it all the time. I'm shifting, and I forget if that's BC, AIC, either way. The point is clearly there's a lot sinking right here. My left rib is flaring out for sure, right? And I'm naturally in this position. So, and I'll exaggerate it so the camera could see, but now if I'm trying to rotate from this position, then I could obviously rotate one way easier. So what you're saying is I'm trying to get you to kind of maybe even work those other muscles on the other side, and you might have to isolate and come up with individual exercises to get you to get that left side crunch, or however someone might put it.
Yeah, and I'd say to even reverse engineer that even more is the zone of apposition is basically the position of our diaphragm. And so the diaphragm, the right hemidiaphragm sits higher than the left hemidiaphragm. So naturally, with our normal anatomy, with the position of our liver is, where the position of our heart is, and so on. So we already are asymmetrical, which I think is really important to acknowledge, because we're always thinking of creating this perfect symmetry, but we are not symmetrical humans. Right. Yeah. And so with that, like what you're saying is, okay, well now I've become a little bit over patterned here. And so typically the left hip comes a little bit forward, then you start to adapt and orient yourself to neutral again. So then you create potentially side bend, right neck issues, and so on. So you're just essentially trying to orient forward again. So a starting point, I would say for everyone, is the diaphragm. So is your diaphragm in the position that it's supposed to be? Is it stacked over top of the pelvis? So that you have an orientation of respiratory diaphragm over pelvic diaphragm. And once we orient you there, then everything is a lot more clear in terms of our assessment. right? But if everything's really asymmetrical and everything's tight, and yes, it could be all these really specific things, but generally speaking, that's what we're trying to do.
And I like the term the canister, is right what they usually say. So awareness of the rib cage, awareness of your pelvis, and being able to stack the rib cage over the pelvis. So now there's going to be probably, a ton of exercises, but can you give an example of maybe one or a couple of exercises that might help with that?
Absolutely. So the first thing, if I were going to say just in terms of order of progression, I would say I would always teach someone diaphragmatic breathing first, because even though we have an assumption that everyone knows what that is, 100% of the people that I've ever worked with in my entire career do not. So so I will make sure that they understand tongue at the roof of your mouth is your proper tongue position, should be touching your top teeth. Your teeth should be gently apart. And when you're breathing in, you want to be thinking about breathing up, not straight back. And as you're breathing in, you're getting 360 degrees of pressure. So it's not a belly breath. Even though we might use that in layman's terms, it's not a belly breath. It's a 360 canister breath. So back of the rib cage, front, side, right? And I typically will teach that while someone's just lying on their back in hook lying position, knees bent, just totally relaxed, maybe head supported, just so they can appreciate, understand what diaphragmatic breathing is. Then I would say the next major exercise would be, sometimes they would have their feet on the wall, but just lying on their back, feet on the wall, or if they were able to do it without that. And the first thing we would be doing is working on that stacked position. So walking down with your hands to give yourself that feedback of right at T8 here. You would take your breath in and then exhale, connect this to the floor. Walk your fingers down a little bit lower, right to below the belly button. Breath in, connect this. So your back is totally flat like it was as a baby, okay? But it's relaxed flat, not this huge posterior tilt that you're getting there with this doming in the abdomen to be able to achieve that. And from there, a million progressions is not quite, we could call it a dying bug, but really it's actually learning how to stack your rib cage over your pelvis, be able to breathe in that position and be able to breathe into the posterior rib cage, and then progressing it. So it might look like, oh, we're going to reach an arm. We might do a march. We might do really advanced exercise. You can move into hollows and things like that. But that just kind of gives you a sense, and it's a great way to teach all the concepts together. It's magic.
Yeah, I love it. And it also makes me think too, a lot of times, nowadays we spend a lot of time in a chair, on a bed, in ways where your back is not able to really kind of get that expansion.
Right.
So maybe being in, on all fours or in a position where can now help allow the back to even expand.
Absolutely.
And then I think about also doing alternating stuff.
For sure.
Just almost feel like that's gonna, when you talk about stiffness, anything that can alternate is gonna be a little less stiff.
Correct.
And so I'm thinking, being out of the chair, out of a bed, out of I'm thinking my couch where my back is always, against something flat. And then maybe even doing, I think about like a crawling,
bear crawling,
stuff like that.
Yep.
Right.
And I think it's progressions. I think at least where I've come in my career is that I used to very early on classify something as good or bad. Right. And I've grown and I don't do that anymore. Yep. Because I think there's so many good. My biggest thing is it's how are you getting there and why? And to get there, all of them are good. Crawling's great. But if someone doesn't know how to breathe and they don't know how to do, let's just say if we reverse engineer that, they don't know how to breathe, they don't know how to do a good bird dog,
Right.
All right. Then they don't know how to do a really well beast, like just holding the position. Then doing a bear crawl is not the right progression at the right time for that person.
Right.
And so I think that's the important part is just, are you really kind of understanding and be able to implement these concepts into your movement? And I love the quote by Gray Cook is, if you can't breathe in a position, you don't own a position.
I love that
And
too.
I always reference that because that is the truth. As soon as you lose your breath, as soon as you go into that 2-minute plank and you are not breathing, you don't own it.
Yeah. I used to say in the martial arts, if you can't do it slow, you can't do it fast.
Yes.
And what I meant by that was a lot of times people might do, for example, their roundhouse kick, and it could be sloppy form, and you might be able to get to the bag, and it might have done what you were intending for it to do, but you did it sloppy, or you didn't pivot your foot, and now your knee is probably gonna, feel some pain, or you're not rotating it.
Yeah.
I want to know that every part of this movement, you could hold it and you can own it. And I'll isolate, we'll just lift the leg, we'll just do that. In each piece, I kind of break it up, and we do it as an individual. I want to see that you can hold it there, move it slow. Then now you've earned the right, I think, to move it explosively, and that makes me think very similar. There's the progressions before you're just kind of moving into something sloppy.
Yeah, martial arts is the epitome of what we're talking about.
Right.
It is, everything about progressions and quality movement and all of it.
For the most part, there's I'd also like to think I'm a good instructor.
Okay.
No, but martial arts is very, very, especially, I don't want to give anybody more credit, but I do karate or any striking art, but I feel like karate wellness is embedded in it. Like they've done a
100%.
great job of, every hitting every plane of motion and every body part, and but yeah, and I'm sure every art though still has its.
Yeah, but I have always thought that about martial arts. I actually reference martial arts all the time just because it's really built around the breath, right? And that's what really movement should be, is if you're going to have a high quality movement, you have to have high quality breathing.
Right. So I didn't ask it before, but I wanted to see if maybe you can help with it. But a definition for stability. I don't know if we officially said it, but do you have one?
Yeah, so I typically refer to it as sequencing, timing, and coordination. That's kind of how I define stability, because it is different than strength, which is being able to generate force. And that's why it's also seems esoteric, right? It's hard to comprehend because it's like, what is sequencing? What is coordination? But ultimately, all of those things have to happen at the right time and the right order for it, and as a unit, for it to be a stabilizing position or movement. And so the example I love to give is, because I did this for so long, which was the K-vest for golf, and was able to look at kinematic sequence of golf swings. And I always said, if we could do this for every single movement or sport, I'm sure you can for most.
Right.
It's so powerful to be able to see exactly that analogy. It's all about, how are you transitioning? How are you sequencing? How is this affecting your accuracy, your distance, and so on?
Did you do that here?
I did it at my old clinic. I did it, tried a little bit here, but my ceiling was too low. So had to, move on, but that's okay. But I learned so much from it, and just doing so many really high level golfers, pros, et cetera, and just being able to see that repeatedly and then be able to look at their movement and pair that. So this person has a stability issue in their hip, but this person has a T-spine mobility issue, right? So I'd be able to pair their physical limitations with their swing and be able to see how that's transferring into how they are actually sequencing.
And are you able to give some corrective
For
things,
sure.
and then you're able to see the growth
Absolutely.
of that swing?
Absolutely, which was just magical, right? To be able to say, okay, here's the if they of course did them. Here's the very specific things you need to work on. here is the swing. Now, I'm not a golf pro by any means, right? But here would be the things you need to implement in your swing. And then obviously there's the skill transfer. So that's where I would say these are the things that I would suggest you talk to your pro about, and so that you can start to work on this very specific principle within your swing, whether it was the backswing or it was the transition or whatever area. Normally it was backswing primarily, but then the pro could be able to really speak to the skill aspect.
Nice. So when you're in the stacked position, what should you be able to either see or feel? And what I mean by that, like maybe in your foot, like I feel like I'm on my toes. I might not be in a stacked position. Like, is there anything in the body that I should be able to see? But then sometimes people, you can see it, but they're not faking it, but it looks like they're there, but they're not. Is there something I should feel in the body as well?
When you are in your stacked position, so if we kind of think of sitting or standing, and if you take your breath in and then you exhale, the exhale is going to bring the ribs down. So that should coincide with a good breathing pattern for you, because the muscles that are doing that, your obliques, your rectus, are going to pull the ribs down, almost like you're doing a little mini crunch. So when you're in that position, unless there are really chronic issues, which there could be, pain, stiffness, joint issues, so on, it should feel like your center of mass, which would be right below your belly button, is over your base of support, which would be an imaginary circle in between the arches of your feet. And that is going to be your best position in terms of, like, if you went from there to a deadlift or to a lunge or to a squat or any dynamic movement, walking, running, etc. If we have that position, you're going to be able to stabilize faster, which then means you're going to be able to generate force better and faster.
Can we call that position neutral? Like a neutral spine?
We could call that position neutral. I've sort of gotten away from that a little bit, but I think for the purpose of this conversation, yes. I think neutral went a little too far with, like there was all these extremes of is this good, right? Is this good, bad?
Right.
And the reality is we're not going to be there 100% of the time, nor should we be. Right? If you're playing a sport, if you're athletic, you're reaching to, of course. So we want to be able to move in all planes, of course. So I think it's within reference to what would be our standing posture, what would be our sitting posture, how would we be training our key fundamental movement patterns, and so on.
So if somebody wanted to learn more exercises for the deep core, do you have a YouTube channel? Or
I do have,
can check out?
I do. So I have a YouTube channel, and actually just did a little video on deep core in preparation for this. Perfect. So I did do a video. I also have an app where I have a whole host of exercises from all of your deep core, but also we didn't talk about feet.
Right.
And
I see your barefoot now.
I thought I'd throw that in there real quick.
Well, yeah.
So your feet are part of your core, and that is something that I think we forget all of the time. So as I started with in the beginning, is the deep front fascial line goes from the bottom of the foot into the back of the knee, the inner thigh, the adductors, pelvic floor, deep hip stabilizers, diaphragm, all the way up to the neck and throat. So pretty amazing. And so when we are, I think one of the most important things is as we're transitioning from, okay, now you know how to breathe, cool. Okay, now you can crawl, great. We start to progress these things. We have to get people into standing and moving and dynamic activities, for sure. One of the things that bugs me a lot is pelvic floor rehab, where everyone's on the table the entire time. And that is the most...
You have to be on your feet.
Yes.
You're going to be on your feet outside.
Yes. And as quickly as you can do that, the better. Sometimes people might be in pain, and sometimes people might have a really dysregulated nervous system, and you cannot stabilize if you are not in a safe place. So when you're kind of like beating your head against the wall, like, why can't this person stabilize? Why can't they breathe? Why can't they learn how to control their core? then it could be because of the nervous system. Maybe they're nervous with you. Maybe they have a lot going on in their lives, but ultimately they have to be safe to be able to stabilize. And so there's reasons, but ultimately we have to integrate into the ground as soon as possible. And with that is specifically with your feet, with being barefoot, stimulating the skin and the sensory receptors on the bottom of the feet so that you can ultimately have faster stabilization. So if we kind of think of having shoes and socks on, and we're constantly blocking that information from coming in to our body. So everything we do with shoes and socks, it's delayed information.
So I should have took my socks.
It's okay. But I'll forgive you. But as soon as you can take your socks off and you can actually stimulate those receptors with the skin on the bottom of the feet, then you begin to really integrate that whole deep front fascial line and begin to stabilize faster, so your movement is more accurate. And therefore, you're going to be able to generate more force.
Yeah, you did, commend the martial arts. Everything we do is barefoot.
I know. I told you, I use martial arts as a reference all the time. Huge fan.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I love the piece that you said about the nervous system and being able to relax. I think that is tremendous. Like if I'm stuck in a pattern, right? So I always go to that pattern because that's where I'm most comfortable. And if I'm going to learn and try something new, I have to be vulnerable. And if I'm not comfortable, I can't be vulnerable. And a lot of those things aren't even you consciously thinking of it. Your body is just not going to let you go there. It's going to stiffen up, and I'm not receptive. I'm not trying anything new. I'm going to go up to what works, and I'm going to stick to that again and again. So I love the piece that you said about that, and getting the feet on the ground, and maybe even being outdoors a bit, or stimulating the senses when you're doing this stuff can help calm the body and get you in the zone.
Absolutely.
So we're wrapping it up. Last thing, any last words that maybe you want to share, or if somebody was, listening to this episode, is there, when they go back to the gym tomorrow, what can they think of, or are there any last words that you want to share?
Yeah, let me add one thing, if that's okay, that I didn't touch on, but I do think is important. And this was also something that I think evolved in my career, is I was always obsessed with breathing and core since I can remember. Right. But the thing that I didn't realize is that so many people can't physically breathe because of airway dysfunction. And so the reason I'm bringing that up is that when you begin this process of, can I breathe diaphragmatically? Can I do all those things? Tongue at the roof of my mouth, et cetera, and you feel like every time you breathe, it's making you feel more stressed. Your neck and shoulders are getting tight, and it just feels like you can't breathe. Then that might be a physical, structural abnormality that you're experiencing that is preventing you from being able to breathe properly. And that is very important to assess and get addressed, whether that's sometimes for some people that's a sleep study, that could be an airway evaluation, that could be going to an ENT, and so on. So I think that's really important, because that is a huge part of my practice. Because if talking about nervous system, if you're not breathing well, you're not sleeping well, your nervous system is always dysregulated. And so we could talk about, again, all the core exercises, but if these foundational things aren't addressed, then we're kind of missing a huge piece. And I'd say the take home is that, which I'll say a million times over, is that breathing is the foundation. So if you're looking for a starting point, I would say if somebody's already working out, it would be, can you breathe in this pattern your entire workout? Whether you're doing a deadlift or you're doing a quadruped bird dog, can you breathe? And that is the biggest challenge for everyone, without a doubt.
And breathing efficiently.
Correct.
Everybody's going to breathe. You're going to get through the workout, but breathing efficiently.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's say you were doing a heavy deadlift, it still would be a Valsalva, but it's still ultimately a diaphragmatic pattern. It's just changing how you're managing intra-abdominal pressure. So you still would be inhaling through the nose, quick inhale, exhale through that closed glottis, creating that intra-abdominal pressure, keeping that pressure there. And that is going to in turn lift the pelvic floor to create that stability at the base. So no matter what, there might be different variations of it, but it's ultimately the same pattern of breathing for everything. And so if you're doing, let's say, a bicep curl, you should be able to breathe in and out through your nose the whole time.
Yeah.
Right? And so that would be my first suggestion. And then sometimes it's as easy, if someone's already working out, is just implementing that to the things that they're already doing. If it's somebody new, I think that going through that developmental sequence of, starting exercises on your back and really learning how to coordinate everything together, then going into that tabletop position, learning how to integrate your shoulders and the serratus and really connect there, then beginning to go into higher level patterns and just being able to each step along the way integrate all of it, because everything's a core exercise. That's the reality. If you're doing it the right way, everything is. I do believe in doing specific work, whether it's anti-rotation, rotation, it's, higher level body tension exercises, hollows. I think all of it's good. I don't think you need to spend hours on it if you are doing it and integrating it into your entire life.
Yeah.
Right?
I think everything for me is, I think I might even be over infatuated, even like when I'm driving or when I'm like,
what's happening in my core here?
Yeah. But everything can be a core exercise. You're doing it all the time.
Yeah, so I don't think it needs to be obsessive. And then there's a whole layer of aesthetics and really getting into advanced athletic training, and you need to be able to train that accordingly. So I think that's where I'm kind of going back to all of it's good. It's just that it's not good. My example is, I could probably give two good ones. I go to the gym, I see somebody doing on the machine, the ab crunch machine, 100 crunches, about this motion, this pace.
Right.
The stomach is doming, right? So doming means there's zero stabilization that's happening. That's like the prime way to get a hernia. Belly's just popping out.
Belly look.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so that, not effective at all, only going to potentially hurt someone in an indirect way at some point. And then the other would be somebody that is, let's say, doing toes to bar.
Right.
And they're going super fast, tons of momentum, just swinging their legs up, and no control, same thing, all of just that constant abdominal doming. And that is, again, sports hernias, etc. So not helpful, only gonna hurt. So we don't need to go to those two extremes. It's just learning how to build on top of a really solid foundation.
I'm sure I don't want to open up a whole nother can of worms, but should people squeeze their bottom like they use in the bathroom almost?
So
is that too much of a can of worms?
So, no, that's okay. I could touch on it quickly. So that is, I'm gonna just say, maybe sometimes. Because on average, no, because you don't want to be creating that really tight posterior pelvic floor.
Right.
But sometimes people can begin to learn how to develop some tension and create a better position in the very short term by using their glutes to do that. Right? So I'm going to say it depends. I maybe wouldn't say squeeze as much as they possibly can, but I will sometimes use that cue of, hey, can you kind of try to squeeze your glutes a little bit here to create that full body tension, and then they have better integration.
And I'm thinking less the glute and more of like the pelvic floor.
Okay, yeah. So try not to do hardcore posterior pelvic floor, because most people are tight there. So way more people have a hypertonic pelvic floor than not. So super mindful of that. And that's because they're not breathing down to the pelvic floor often, or they're holding stress, or they've experienced trauma.
Right. Well, so we dove into some great stuff here. I think, people can continue to follow you. You're on Instagram. What's your Instagram handle?
The Movement Paradigm.
And YouTube is
Movement Paradigm.
That also. So it makes it nice and easy. And I'm sure you'll have a link in your Instagram and people can click that and check out more as well. Yeah,
and I have the Movement Paradigm app, which is on Google and Apple too. And they have lots of different programs. You can subscribe with core programs, barefoot programs, strength programs, and so on.
And if anybody is in the Pennsylvania area, maybe they'll come check you out.
Come check me out, yeah.
Some of my people are a little far, but there'll be somebody tuning in from Pennsylvania. I had a couple of people on the podcast from here too.
Awesome.
So thank you so much for today.
Thank you.
And I look forward to talking again soon.